Hey everyone, Avatar Guy here. A new interview with James Cameron has just come out with GQ, and I've just read through it once, and I just thought that I would take this opportunity to go through the interview and pull out some of the best bits because it's honestly one of the best interviews I think I've ever read from Jim. And a note for anyone who's new to this: James Cameron often goes by Jim as his nickname, and because I guess followed him for so long, I've ended up like, doing that too. So if I accidentally say Jim here and there throughout the going through, then forgive me. Um, a little secret: I have been a fan of James Cameron for a very long time. There are loads of videos on it on my YouTube channel that you can check out. And as I always say with Ashen, who helps me with the channel, um, I'm actually probably a bigger James Cameron fan than I am just a pure Avatar fan. So for me, this article is basically Christmas come early. We've already got Avatar 2 to also look forward to. So let's dive in. Right off the start, we have this cool picture of Jim sat on what looks like one of the huge props from Avatar 2. It's obviously some kind of RDA Secops vehicle. And again, showing that not everything in these movies is going to be CGI. They do use massive amounts of practical effects. Um, and the title, I think, is apt. It's The Return of James Cameron, Box Office King. And it just goes over the fact that it's been 13 years since Jim released Avatar, which was the highest grossing film of all time, and now he's back. And so it's by Zach Barron over at GQ, who I think, again, this is a really fantastic article. And I'll leave a description to the full article in the description so that you can click it and read it through for yourself. Geography by Levin Baird. So this interview has gone over to New Zealand and actually sat down with Jim and talked to him. And it's kind of weird because recently I watched they open it almost straight away with the fact that he was the first person to solo descend to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, and the Challenger Deep is the very bottom of the Marianas Trench, which is the deepest crack in the world, I guess. And they talk about Victor Vescovo, I think that's how you pronounce his name, another explorer who has also been to the bottom of the Challenger Deep after James Cameron went. And they have this funny little thing. So you talk about that he became the first person in history to descend the 6.8-mile distance solo, and one of only the few people to ever go that deep. Since then, others have followed, most prominently a private equity titan and former Naval Reserve intelligence officer turned explorer named Victor Vescovo. But Cameron is adamant that none have surpassed him. Vescovo, Cameron told me, claimed he went deeper, but you can't. So he's basically just making shit up. And so I thought it was really funny. And actually, I watched a documentary recently that had Victor Vescovo in it. And yeah, it was really good. So then, it carries on and goes that, as people sometimes do in response to Cameron's films, Vescovo disagrees. That he says that he has a different scientific perspective, which I think I'm going to side with Jim on this. The bottom's the bottom. I can't imagine how he missed it when he was down there. And then we have this little bit here which had me laughing, which was that that while he has a different scientific perspective, that he said that the explorer Victor Vescovo rang James Cameron or emailed James Cameron and said, "I watched Titanic at the Titanic," and James Cameron replied, "Yeah, but I made Titanic at the Titanic." A classic, I think, Jim retort, which I just absolutely love. And actually, if you look up Victor Vescovo, he looks a little bit like Jim, which makes me laugh as well. And then so they carry on. They talk about that he's written and directed some of the most successful films of all time, and that it would be fair to call him the father of the modern action movie, which he helped to invent with his debut The Terminator, and then reinvent with the second Aliens. And that he's much more than just a filmmaker, that he's also a scientist, and that I've mentioned this many times on my things before, a camera he helped design served as the model for one that is currently on Mars, attached to the Mars rover Curiosity. And then it talks about this guy, the Daniel Goldin, who's the former head of NASA, said that sometimes James Cameron seems like a man in search of a problem to solve or a deadly experience to survive, but he is emphatic that there's a purpose to the challenges he takes on. I think this really does. I think it's really, I don't know, like hearing these people who are extremely high up talk about this and talk about Jim in this way. It really shows you how how pioneering he is. I've said this in things before, but I genuinely do and stand firm to the fact that James Cameron is a modern day Leonardo da Vinci. He's not just a filmmaker. He can do so many other things, and he touches on this later in the article, which I was very pleased. And then, so yeah, the head of NASA, and then, but Jim retorts back after this, and the head of NASA is saying that he looks like a man who always wants to solve a problem and do something extremely risky. But James Cameron's response is, "There's plenty of dangerous things that I won't go near because they're dangerous, but they have a randomness factor. Oh yeah, because they have a randomness factor to them." Cameron said, "Whitewater rafting, fuck that." So he's happy to do things that are dangerous, but he wants to do things that are dangerous that he can control. And again, it seems unsurprising from someone like James Cameron. Then we go to the next bit we talk about. So in December, Disney will release Avatar: The Way of Water, many days. And it's the first feature Cameron has directed in 13 years, and the first of 4 planned Avatar sequels. And he says that, James Cameron says, it's about his family. He says, "Many of the main characters from the first film are back, but older and with kids to take care of. What do 2 characters who are warriors, who take chances and have no fear, do when they have children and they still have this epic struggle?" Which immediately is like, seems very much like this is almost biographical. James Cameron and his wife Susie Amis Cameron, she was an actress, he's obviously a film director. That you can see the parallels there, that they've gone from this high-powered, exciting world, Hollywood, to one where they have children and they want to protect their environment, things like that. And then he goes on to, their instinct is to be fearless and do crazy things, jump off cliffs, dive bomb into the middle of an enemy armada, but you've got kids. What does that look like in a family setting? Among other things, Cameron said, The Way of Water could be a friendly but pointed rebuke to the comic book blockbusters that now war with Cameron's films at the top of the box office. I mean, I wouldn't call it a war. When you've sent all those films at Jim and he still haven't managed to beat him, it doesn't feel like it's really a war. But that's my opinion. And Jim does one of his classic criticisms of, I think, comic book movies, which is I completely agree with. I was consciously thinking to myself, okay, all these superheroes, they never have kids. They never really have to deal with real things that could hold you down and give you feet of clay in the real world. And Sigourney Weaver, who's also returning, as we all know, she talks about this, and that, it's a parallel to his real life, and she says that Jim loves his family so much, and I feel that love in our film. It's as personal a film as he's ever made. And I think fans of James Cameron can almost see that just already from the interviews he's given and the little snippets and things that we've seen. So I really like that. And then goes on about that for this next section, they talk about the original Avatar, brightly coloured dream of a movie set in the year 2145, about an ex-marine falling in love with a blue 9-foot-tall princess on a foreign moon, Pandora. And that's a pretty good summation of the original Avatar, which is being stripped, invaded of its natural resources. And they talk about the production, that the digital effects used to transform human actors into animated creatures. And that for The Way of Water, the team had to start all over again. They needed new cameras that could shoot underwater, and a motion capture system that could collect separate shots from above and below the water and integrate them into a unified virtual image. They needed new algorithms, new AI, to translate what Cameron shot into what you see. So this isn't just, it's almost like they had to go back and start from scratch, which is kind of crazy, you know? And then and then they go on to this next bit where he talks about 2 really important points. It's like this is the first paragraph. When I read it, I was like, wow. And I even posted it over on my Instagram, which is that when the number of iterations they go through. In fact, I'm going to read you this paragraph, right? Just so everyone can understand it. So, nothing would work the first time, Cameron said, and the production tried it. Sorry, nothing would work the first time Cameron and the production tried it, or the second, or usually the third. One day in Wellington, New Zealand, where Cameron was finishing the film, he showed me a single effects shot numbered 405. That means there's been 405 versions of this before it gets to me, he said. Cameron, who has been working on the movie since 2013, it was due out years ago in September, he still wasn't done. The Way of Water was expensive to make. How expensive? Very fucking. According to Cameron, who told me he'd informed the studio that the film represented the worst business case in movie history. In order to be profitable, he said, you'd have to be the third or fourth highest grossing film in history. That's your threshold. That's your break even. So, just to put this into perspective, Jim is basically saying that these effects shots are going through 405 different iterations before he even gets to see them. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of effecting. And then these movies have cost so much money that to break even, they're going to have to be the third or fourth highest grossing films ever, which pretty much means they have to make over $2 billion. He's really set a high bar for himself. But then again, this is James Cameron, and he's the man who raises the bar. So on to the next part. He works late into the evening, day after day. And again, this is something that we always hear about James Cameron, is that he has a work ethic unlike anybody else. I think he famously said that he might not be better than some directors or like visually superior, but he will outwork anyone. And again, it's one of the reasons he inspires me, because I find it, like, I'm not going to say I work as hard as James Cameron, not even close, not even a fraction. But I definitely think, it's a while. Yeah, it's something that drives me. Sorry, I'm just referring back to my notes as well, just so I don't miss anything. And then he talks about that he's enjoying himself, and that I like difficult. I'm attracted by difficult. Difficult is a fucking magnet for me. I go straight to difficult. And I think it probably goes back to this idea that there are lots of smart, really gifted, really talented filmmakers out there that just can't do the difficult stuff. So that gives me a tactical edge to do something nobody else has ever seen. Because the really gifted people don't fucking want to do it. I can't say that he's not talented, but I guess it's a kind of talent, and it's a weird, humble Jim, but not humble in his classic sense, which makes me laugh. And then we go on. So we see Cameron and his fifth wife, Susie Ames Cameron, live year round in New Zealand, where they have a 5,000-acre farm east of Wellington, and the ocean on one side, lake on the other, mountains in the distance. And it shows how he really is committed to environmentalism. He's not just, I think, he's not just a Hollywood person anymore who talks about this. Talks about it, but he's actually walking the walk, which I find extremely. I think more people should be like this. And I mean, I'm not rich enough, but I also think that James Cameron would probably agree that it should be something that more people are trying to do, even if it's a small thing. I think he does admit that a lot of the things that he's able to do is a product of him being as wealthy as he is. He talks about some ideas that he's had. So he said that that they're the biggest supplier of organic brassicas, a category of plant that includes broccoli, kale, cotton, cauliflower. And that for a while, Cameron attempted an experimental agricultural project, taking 25 acres of trees and intercropping between them, producing 143 different species of fruit, different apples, pears, and berries. But that provided not to be viable commercially. So he thought maybe he'd just open the land up to the public, and civilians could just wander in and eat, like Eden. We could probably feed 1,000 people out of that forest, he told me. But then he realised there was also a flaw in that plan. His food forest, far from the nearest city, was nowhere close to the people it was meant to feed. You learn as you go, he said, shrugging. This next bit made me kind of laugh, is that he said the reporter asks him if he's lonely, moving away from California, and he says, "I don't have any friends, so it's okay." But with only a hint of a smile. I feel like from this thing that Susie's his best friend, and he has his family, and then he also has, I guess, like I bet he must be friends with John Landau. Feels like they're very close. They've known each other a very long time. But yeah, I can imagine that it's quite lonely at the top, so to speak. He talks about LA, and it says that when Cameron flies over Los Angeles and it's overtaxed the power grid, it's thousands on millions of acres of buildings. He recently did. He finds himself thinking, "Wow, this is an abomination against nature. This place, I can't believe I lived here so long." And then he describes his this next bit's crazy. Actually, it's something I've seen videos of him training to shoot, but I didn't realize that he was actually like fully qualified. So I'll read this full paragraph, which is Cameron's Malibu compound was known for its survivalist vibe. Fast cars, a security team trained in fighting wildfires, guns, assault rifles, but assault rifles are banned in New Zealand. And Cameron told me he perceived a less feral and more collectivist spirit in his neighbours. I don't have to think about guns here, he said. In LA, he'd have himself trained by one of the best championship shooters in America. He's the guy that taught Keanu Reeves how to beat John Wick. I was his first Hollywood contact. I trained with him for 3 years. He didn't know anybody in Hollywood. A guy named Taron Butler up in Simi Valley. He has a YouTube channel. I'll find a link and put it in the description as well. So I'm a competition grade shooter, but I don't have to worry about that here. Again, Jim bragging, but that he doesn't have to worry about it. And again, if I was a competition grade shooter, I'd also brag. And again, instead of 68, Cameron rises at 4:45 a.m., often kickboxing in the mornings, and moves between their farm and a modest home they keep in Wellington, a windy mid-sized city in the southern end of New Zealand's North Island, where the director Peter Jackson's digital effects company, Weta FX, has long been headquartered. And then it talks about them, that he's working out of Peter Jackson's old offices, and that the Avatar sequels were a huge piece of business for New Zealand and their overall population, and that sometimes he feels like they have to remind people that these movies costing all this money is ultimately money going into the New Zealand economy. It's massively helping their economy, even if they're perceived sometimes to be pulling resources away. And then we talk about, I guess, his biggest films is that he defends spending massive amounts of budgets, and talks about, he says that I used to be really defensive about that because it was always the first thing anybody would mention, Cameron said. And now I'm like, if I can make a business case to spend $1 billion on a movie, I will fucking do it. You want to know why? Because we don't put it all in a single pile and light it on fire. We give it to people. That money was going to be spent somewhere, Cameron said. If the studio agrees and thinks it's a good investment, as opposed to buying an oil lease off the north of Scotland, which somebody would think was a good investment, why not do it? Today, all of his films have made their money back, many of them spectacularly, and that's a little bit of an understatement too. And this bit, which I really like, I probably need to try and embody it a little bit more myself, is that self-doubt in general is not something Cameron has a lot of experience with. I don't think I'm hardwired with that. I don't know why it sounds egotistical, but I think there's an innocence to it. I really do. I don't think it's about, yeah, I think I'm better than you. I just think it's more like, wow, that's really interesting. Let me just pursue that idea for a while. Cameron, who grew up in Hollywood, Ontario, and then later Orange County, and that he's always the kind of person whose confidence, I guess, is massive. In fact, Gail Ann Hurd, another one of his ex-wives, has mentioned this in the past in interviews, that he has this aura about him, this energy, this real confidence that you can feel when he walks into a room. And that, yeah, he ends that bit with that he was different as a child, happy, but different. And then I think it talks about this is one of the most famous ones, and definitely check it out if you can, which is that he was a truck driver when he made The Terminator, and that he was in his 20s, he was a truck driver, and the way he taught himself filmmaking was he'd go to the library, photocopy dissertations and books about filmmaking techniques, and that's how he did it. In fact, he ends it with that I was either getting stoned and watching Saturday Night Live's first season, or I was going through this stuff, chapter and verse, and making my own notes and all that. I basically gave myself a college education in visual effects and cinematography while I was driving a truck. He's basically the Goodwill Hunting of filmmaking. Um, and then he talks about him being hired by Roger Corman, Terminator and Aliens, which everyone is well aware of. And then, again, this bit I think is really important, that he talks about his creative experience and that a lot of these things come to him in dreams. In fact, talks about it in Tech Noir, his art book, and even mentions one of the topic titles is "Dreaming with Your Eyes Wide Open." That he dreamt about Avatar when he was 19. The bioluminescent forests, the people running around in this forest, and he details that here. And in fact, even the original Terminator came to him as a metal man climbing towards him while he was having a fever and had a dream about it. And he jokes that it was lucky that when he woke up, he actually drew that bioluminescent forest, and so that when people tried to sue him when Avatar was so successful, he could go back to it and say, "Look, I've had this idea for years. You aren't suing me, and I've got proof for it." And then at the end of this article is something that I really like as well, which is they mention Zoe Saldana and that how the approach of the Avatar films is so different to the approach of Marvel, which is that the Marvel franchises are built by dozens of comic book artists and writers and directors who work together to create stories. By contrast, Avatar is the result of the vision of a single man. Without Jim's heavy brain, she told me, this would all fall apart. I think that that's like one of the things we rarely see in movie making now. We have like Christopher Nolan, and who writes with his brother, and they make films, and that's like an author's vision. It's one person's vision. We had, I don't know, like a lot of films in the past where they were the vision of a single person, and that's that person's vision that you're seeing on the screen. Whereas in recent decades, that's changed. You've got much more movie making by committee and much more collaboration, and lots of things based on already existing material that people can communally reference. And with Avatar, that's not the case. It's literally a single man's vision being projected onto that screen. It's not only different in what we're seeing of the CGI and the world, etc. It's different in its process, and I think that shines through. Again, talk about his predecessors, and they talk about fellow auteurs. Auteurs, by the way, I think it's like a French term, and I think it just basically means what I've already described. It's a person who, it's like the film is their vision, that individual's vision. Yeah, and then he talks about, he said quotes very much like this before, that he talks about that he's never done a small film, and that he doesn't care about that, that actually he considers his big films even like small films. And he says, on a given day, I might be doing a scene with 2 actors in a room, me hand-holding the camera. How is that any different than the smallest independent film? It's just that maybe the next day, I'm doing a battle with 40,000 people. I like to do that too. Which again, if that's true, that's interesting if we're going to see a 40,000 person battle in a movie in the Avatar sequel. That's crazy. I don't know if we've ever seen something on that scale. I know there's a Russian movie, an old Soviet movie, where they had tens of thousands of extras in battles. But to see that in a Hollywood movie is going to be insane. A nice picture of Jim. And then again, this is again, I always love learning something new about him that I never even knew before. And I was just going to read this. When Cameron moves, he moves fast and favours one side. When I asked him what he'd done to give himself a limp, he looked at me curiously. I've got one short leg, he said. It doesn't slow me down any, though. I remember my first wife, Sharon Williams. There's a nice image of her in the Tech Noir art book. When we were just first dating, she said, walk ahead of me on the sidewalk. And I said, why? She said, I want to study your walk. I turned around and said, why? She said, well, I think I can correct it. And his response is, fuck you. Again, typical Jim response. And then so they talk about the fact that he follows him into this big sound mixing room where they're currently sound mixing the soundtrack for the sequels, and that they're working on this noisy interrogation scene. Interesting, again, they're interrogating someone in the new movie, so there's a new interrogation scene. And the film's composer, Simon Franklin, replacing James Horner, already written a score for the sequence, and Cameron and his mixers were trying to balance the music against the sound effects in various shots. And he says, can you just play the effects themselves? And they do it. there's no sound, and then it doesn't work. So basically, he makes a joke that the reason it's not working is because there's a famous reporter in the room, recording them, which I think is funny, and that they have to reset it. Which then leads on to this discussion about how James Cameron had this ferocious reputation, and that he's earned this reputation of having a temper, and someone said he's earned this reputation several times over. On more than one Cameron set, crew members have taken to wearing shirts that read, "You can't scare me, I work for Jim Cameron." Cameron's well aware of this. He thinks that there was a period of time early on when that reputation worked in my favour. He told me later, and it took on this Paul Bunyan-esque, slightly larger than life quality. And then there was a legitimate time when I looked at all right, why am I getting so upset, and what is this solving? And he finished it with, "I'm not saying I don't get upset once in a while. I mean, everybody, I think, is entitled to a bad day. But whereas before it might have been once every couple of weeks, now it's like twice a year. The temperous Jim doesn't appear that often anymore." And then he talks about how he worked with Ron Howard on Apollo 13, and that Ron Howard was very kind and calm, and that he wanted to embrace his inner Ron Howard. And so, yeah. And he says that, "I always figured that no negative comment was the equivalent of a compliment. That's not how people are wired at all. You have to actually say it out loud." Again, yeah, I really like that. Cameron, despite his famous temper, has always inspired loyalty. His obsessive focus when he's in the middle of making a film often obscures the erudite and charming Canadian he is when he's not working. Weaver, who first met Cameron when she starred in Aliens in 1986, told me, "Really wasn't until we went to Venice with Aliens for the film festival when I was sitting at dinner with him and I went, 'Jesus, you're so funny. Where was this guy the whole time?'" Others have sworn off working with the director only to return, like Kate Winslet, who spoke wearily after the Titanic shoot of her lack of fondness for Cameron's penchant for filming in water tanks, and yet Winslet is not only in the way of water, she learned to freedive for it, so that she could shoot her scenes underwater. "I think she had something to prove to herself," Cameron said. "And so I mean no extra charge for the therapy, but the healing moment where she got to hold her breath underwater for 7.5 minutes and be the underwater queen." And then the sound mixers admit defeat, and he goes over to another area. So he says, "Okay, that was a total failure," and then they go outside, and that they walk unevenly down the carpeted hallway to the VFX location, where someone, barefooted guy called Eric Sandin, is basically talking about him and how they have this really complex process, and that that Jim talks about the camera moves that he wants, etc., etc., and then it gets handed over to Weta to apply the algorithms and layers of animation to complete the template, to bring it to life. The actors are already defined what they did, but it has to be translated and captured to 3D CG characters, and there's all sorts of AI steps in there. And that's him referencing the difference between it being CG and it being animated. And then it says, "Is there anyone else working this way?" And James Cameron laughs, says, "That'd be insane to even try." And that, "I don't mean that we're special. I mean, like, if we hadn't made more money than any other movie in history, this is the last fucking thing we'd be doing," which makes sense that they're doing this insanely complex thing. That the fact that Avatar made $2.9 billion has given them the freedom to do this kind of insane Manhattan Project tier project. Insane. And then it gives this really interesting one, right? So again, this is showing, I think, how much information he has, and how he just taps into it for everything. That they're looking at this thing, right? That's like some kind of it's a scene with the tulkun, the giant whales that we've seen, and that they're showing the scene. They're coming up, and James Cameron says, "It feels a bit late to me," Cameron said, noting the timer of water the whales sprayed as they arrived at the surface. They typically start to exhale just as they're clearing the water, like before they've cleared. They actually start exhaling while they're still underwater, but it's the last half of the lungful that's shotting the water out of the nostrils. They've had a few million years to get their timing down. We've only had a few months. And again, this is the bit that I was referring to earlier. And I've heard this many times in other reports, basically, that he can do any job almost that anyone else can. So he says that not better than other people, just I'm just some brain and a blood creator. He's not a brain and a blood creator. Things he knows what he's asking for the one he's doing. He says that he can really get involved, and again, he's famous for this. And it says that, and John Landau kind of puts it together. He says that, so at the start off, James Cameron, not better than me, he told me, but I'm just more of, and then, sorry, jump over, but he makes a point of understanding enough about enough things that he knows what he's asking for when he asks for something. Jim has the ability to articulate the reason behind anything, John Landau, Cameron's longtime producing partner, told me. And only certain people can handle that. Because of Cameron's clarity and his ability to bring his crew into the process, Saldana said, when you are a part of a James Cameron project, you don't feel like a tool, you don't feel objectified. But she acknowledged it took a particular mental toughness. If you can take it, hang on, because it is always going to be fun and beautiful and rewarding. If you're sensitive and you can't take it, then trust me, there is always somebody else who is going to accept it. She also said she'd gotten good advice from another actor who'd worked with Cameron before, who noticed that Cameron often got so focused on what he was doing that he forgot to eat. He starts getting edgy, make sure you give him some chocolate and you give him some nuts. Which is, again, very funny. And then there's this nice little anecdote where they're looking at the shot of some helicopters landing, and Jim says that's good enough. And then the director says, the CG effects person says, yeah, okay, that's good. And then Jim goes, no. He goes, you need to push back, kind of jokingly. He said, you should strive for perfection and you should argue with me. You should say, you like it, but I don't like it yet. I mean, I guess that's easier said than done when you're telling James Cameron, you know. And then it shows this nice shot of him, I think, in the cockpit of one of the ships that's probably from the upcoming thing. And then we have this really interesting discussion here about the fact that he's only directed 2 feature films in the last 25 years. And that Jim says to him that he's had 50,000 ideas in his head, but that he's just going to continue to working on Avatar. Funny anecdote about him talking about how to pronounce hummus. I don't know, does he pronounce it hummus or hummus? I don't know. I say hummus. So yeah, I think it's kind of, it's interesting that he has all these ideas and all these things that he wants to do, but at the same time, they're obviously having this discussion about how much should he be doing filmmaking, how much should he be doing veganism and plant-based diets and things like that. And this is where it moves on to. It moves on to him discussing his passion for being plant-based. And it says that he's 10 years, 100%, not a molecule that I know of animal entering my face. And I'm healthier than I've ever been. And most of these punks can't even keep up with me. And he says that nobody does empathy better than Hollywood, Cameron told me. But there's a certain point where my mind wants to solve problems that are real world problems. I think it's extremely funny and a kind of backhand to the whole of Hollywood. In fact, I can see a lot of different articles being created just out of this alone. And he talks about that the plant-based thing has taken, that he's been very, very motivated to do it. That he's producing documentaries about veganism. They've bought a factory to produce pea protein, and all this investigation that they're doing. And he says that he loves that stuff as much as filmmaking. And when he ends this bit with, and I know people think that sounds nuts. Wait a minute, you love farming and pea protein as much as movies? And his response is, yeah, pretty much. And that, and he said this before. He says that he doesn't like being the term vegan, and that he's tried to rebrand it. In fact, I've heard him say many times plant-based, vegan, and then here he introduces a new term that I like, which is futurivore. And then that came up with his futurivore. We're eating the way people will eat in the future. We're just doing it early. I'm not a vegan, by the way. I try to be vegetarian as much as possible. But yeah, if I was as rich as Jim, I would definitely be a vegan because I'd have a chef and things like that, and a nice farm. But yeah, I'm not one myself. And then of course there was for a while the career in ocean exploration. So again, this is really showing. I think this article is showing the fact that he is a polymath. That, like Da Vinci, he's got this. If he'd done even a single thing, so in exploration, in the plant-based stuff, in invention, he'd be notable. But he's done all that as well as being an amazing movie maker. In fact, Victor Vescova, who we talked about at the start, who is an explorer, he's an explorer and he's done more exploration than Jim, but he's a notable explorer. And James Cameron, I think, even if he hadn't done anything else except a solo descent to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, would be a notable explorer. He'd still have his own Wikipedia page. When you think about that and all the other things that he's done, you really start to get this idea of just how, yes, giant James Cameron is as a human being. I find it truly inspiring. Um, and then he has this really big discussion about the history of Avatar and his exploration, and that when that he didn't know they was going to still do Avatar, and that there's this famous story that when he went to take the idea of Avatar to Fox, they said no thanks, and he said he's going to take it to Disney, and then Fox eventually said okay, we'll want it, and that he got his way in the end and ended up being the most successful film of all time. And there's this really really funny bit. It said that someone said that they thought the movie was too long, and that Cameron responds to this like this. He says, so this executive comes up to James Cameron and says it's too long, and he begs him to shorten it. And he says, "I'd said something I never thought I'd say to anybody else in the business." Cameron recalled. He told him, "I think this movie is going to make all the fucking money, and when it does, it's going to be too late for you to love the film. The time for you to love the movie is today. So I'm not asking you to say something that you don't feel, but just know that I will always know that no matter how complimentary you are about the movie in the future when it makes all the money," and that's exactly what I said in caps, all the money, not some of the money, all the fucking money, I said, "you can't come back to me and compliment the film or chum along and say, look what we did together. You won't be able to do that." At that point, that particular studio executive flipped out and went bug shit on me. And then I told him to get the fuck out of my office. And that's where it was left. I guess that guy ended up looking really bad, as he did make all the money. Yeah, the film came out with all the money. And this is one of my favourite bits, right? Okay, so he asks Cameron whether he had a theory about why the original Avatar made all that money. And his response is fantastic. "I don't think I need a theory," he said. "I think anybody that's seen the movie knows why. It's a fucking gigantic adventure that's an all-consuming emotional experience that leaves you wrung out by the end of the movie. And it was groundbreaking visually, and it still holds up today. So I don't think I need a theory." I love that. He's right. Anybody who's seen it knows. When you watch it, you know. Um, that bit there, I want that on a poster. It just blows everyone out. I love it. Talks about his deep dive to the Mariana Trench, whether he even wanted to come back to filmmaking, and that he still's got many ideas, but and then this is where it gets kind of like interesting, is that the reason that he decided not to be an explorer and just stick with Avatar, he says that at the end, the answer he landed on was this: "I'm a storyteller, and there's a story to be told." In Avatar, he decided he could explore everything he cared about. And again, mentioned this many times before, he can say everything he wants in these movies. And that, again, this is a quote: "Anything I need to say about conservation and sustainability and all these themes, the pros and cons of technology, and where the human race is headed and all that sort of thing, I could say within that greater landscape." So everything that he wants to say creatively in the story world, he can say in this world, on Pandora, in the world of Avatar. And that, again, more things that we know, that he already shot Avatar 3 and a big portion of 4. And that he asked him a really interesting question, and I was kind of shocked by this answer. He says, would he be happy if Avatar is the thing that ends up being his monument? The monument to him. And he says that he thinks that's an unhealthy question to ask. And he said, "I think, first of all, that's really unhealthy," Cameron said, shaking his head. "Secondly, I'm not done until the big hook comes out from the side of the curtain. So to me, every idea is a work in progress." Which I would love to see him continue to direct until he's old. Look at Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood's directed tons of movies, way past 70. Maybe James Cameron's got that left in him. And then it kind of gets to the, I think this is this is the final bit of the bit where, and this bit's really interesting, right? This is the final bit of the article, and he talks about how the list of things that James Cameron has failed is short, but there are a few destinations that have eluded him, and this is quite a famous one, is that he did do the training to go to space in the late 90s, I think early 2000s, and that he ended up getting a seat onto a space shuttle to go into space. But it didn't pan out because he basically said um, that he talks with the head of NASA, and it's like a scene from one of his movies, and saying that Golding asked Cameron why he wanted to go. Mars was the future. Cameron said, and that would require long duration space flight, and so that Cameron really wanted to see was the human drama of people living in space. Golding offered Cameron a shuttle flight instead, so not to go to the ISS, but he'd see the planet from above. He'd see space. Golding said the ISS at the moment was too difficult, but he wants to go into the ISS, the International Space Station, and the counter offer is no, you can go on one of the shuttles. So not into space like on the ISS, but you can go on one of the shuttles into space. So Cameron decides pretty much no, he doesn't want to do it. Thought about it and he said to himself, maybe everything I've been doing over the last few years leads to this exact moment where the administrator of NASA is willing to make a solid deal to fly me on the space shuttle. But he looked in his heart and he decided no, he would only go to space on his own terms. I said I've got to say no. I want to stick to my plan, even if it can't happen, even if it ultimately gets derailed. First of all, there was a long pause, and Dan looks over to me and he says, "Now I know you're serious." I said, "Damn right, I'm serious." So, so he says that Golden got him in line to go to the ISS. Cameron went to Houston, started training, began mapping the logistics of the shoot, and then going to fly me. Cameron told me then Columbia was lost. For those of you who don't know, yeah, February 1st, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrates on re-entry, taking with it 7 souls. Cameron went to their memorial service, but he never got to go to space. And he asked the interviewer asked James Cameron what level of regret he had for this, and the fact that he never went, and he said 0. Different life. The stuff I did instead was equally cool. Yeah, it would have been great, and I think if I had really, really put my mind to it, I could have remanifested that a few years later with a better camera system and a better plan even. But see, by then, I was into Avatar, and that was a whole other level of cool. I mean, he's implying that Avatar's cooler than going to space, which maybe it is. I don't know about that, Jim. But also the fact that he did choose Avatar over going to space, which I respect. He traded Mars for Pandora, and he's been on his own planet of his own making ever since. Speaking of which, he said he had to get back to finishing the film. There were more effects shots to review. The sound was far from complete. There were hundreds of people just beyond the doorway with 100 problems that only Cameron could solve. We shook hands and he walked me out. And then this final bit really stuck with me. Because again, it's something I never knew about him. So I was driving back to my hotel not too long after when the phone rang. It was Cameron, wanting to talk again about the shuttle flight he turned down, and which eventually became Golden's recollection differs here again, but no matter, a very notorious flight indeed. I forgot the punchline to the story, Cameron said. The punchline is, the shuttle mission I refused, it was the Columbia. His voice rose. I fucking saved my own life by choosing the higher path. So, go. We nearly lost Jim. This is. I encourage you all. Please read the entire article yourself. I purposely kind of jumped over a couple of bits, just because I think it's nicer just to read the actual reporter's prose. This for me was an absolute treat. It confirms everything about James Cameron that I've thought that I knew, and gave me a lot of cool information that I never knew before. It really gets me even more excited for the Avatar sequels, and it just it's weird to say that he is a complete inspiration to me, in every sense of the word. I mean, I'm wearing a shirt that he made, but this isn't his shirt; it's just the same kind of shirt. But yeah, in many ways he is inspiring to me, and I think that that's one of the things that makes these movies so groundbreaking, that they have this genius at the helm, that this Da Vinci kind of character who I think a lot of people sleep on, is they don't realize how amazing he is and the things that he's achieved. To go from being a truck driver who teaches yourself filmmaking from the library to making Titanic and Avatar and Terminator 2 and Avatar 2 and this behemoth of a project, making films unlike anyone else, as well as his exploration, as well as his environmental causes is just truly inspiring, and I really hope that his popularity increases as the sequels come out and as more people realize, what a talent he truly is and what a genius he truly is. Yeah, I think that's it. That's my kind of going over this article. I loved it. I think everyone should read it. I'll drop a link in the description. Please subscribe if you haven't already. This is probably going to be one of my longest videos ever, so thanks for everyone who stuck out to the end. As always, thank you to the Base and Robust Network, and thank you for watching.